Today on the John Ankerberg Show, does advancing science refute or prove the Genesis 1 creation account? My guest is astronomer and astrophysicist Dr. Hugh Ross, who received his PhD in astronomy from the University of Toronto and did postdoctoral research at Caltech on quasars and galaxies. What does the Bible say God created on day 3, day 4, and day 5? And has modern science found evidence that backs up what the Bible says? We invite you to join us to hear a professional astronomer answer these questions. Welcome, I'm John Ankerberg, and we're talking with Dr. Hugh Ross, astronomer and astrophysicist, and we're talking about something that is criticized in secular society most of the time because they don't know what they're talking about. They haven't really studied it, and they haven't studied it in the original languages. A lot of people don't realize that Moses was given this information, not in English, but he was giving it in Hebrew. And there's a difference in the vocabulary of biblical Hebrew that Moses was working with versus what we're working with in English. How many words do we have in the two that we're comparing?
Well, with biblical Hebrew, you got about 3,000 words total if you don't count the names of people in cities. English, you got over 4 million. So yeah, that's where the real problems exist.
Yeah, most people have memorized, but they don't believe in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. There's a phrase in there that actually they don't have a word for. What is it?
Because of how tiny the language is, we shouldn't be surprised that it doesn't have a word for the universe, or that it uses the word day with 4 different definitions, or it uses the word earth or rest. It has 5 different literal definitions. That's what you have to do when you got a tiny vocabulary language. So you always have to look at the context to see which of those multiple definitions you go with.
Yeah, the interpretation of these places has to follow the scientific method, which you did. You grew up as a person that never went to church. Your family was not a Christian at all. You weren't a Christian. You didn't know any Christians. You grew up in Canada that way, and yet through science, you came to the conclusion of what?
My science, basically, when I looked at the Bible, I realized this book is different from all the other holy books I've looked at. It gets all the science right. Moreover, it actually predicts future scientific discoveries. And that's what we've been talking about in Genesis, how you go through Genesis 1. It begins with light appearing on the surface of the earth. And now we got the science to establish, indeed, the earth started off with an opaque atmosphere that became translucent so light could come through. Photosynthesis could begin. Creation day 2, water above, water below. The book of Job tells us in great detail how God designed the water cycle with 3 different kinds of frozen precipitation, 3 different kinds of liquid precipitation. And then we move into creation day 3.
Which is where we're at now.
Yeah, where it basically says Earth begins with no continents, no land masses, just water over the whole surface of the Earth. But a little less than halfway through Earth's history, we have this sudden growth of continental land masses. And we described in the previous episode how the more we learn about the geophysical history of the Earth, the tighter and tighter fit we get with what Genesis taught thousands of years ago. Basically demonstrating the Bible not only gets the science right, it predicts future scientific discoveries. But God's not done. On creation day 3, he says, okay, now that we got these continental land masses, he begins to create plants, vegetation on those continental land masses. And I remember doing several debates with atheist scientists on university campuses where they said, Dr. Ross, here's where the Bible gets it dead wrong. The fossil record tells us we get animals in the oceans before we have vegetation on the land masses. The Bible's got it the other way around. And my response at that time was to say, well, animals have bones and shells, which means their fossil remains are going to last a long, long time. That's not the case with vegetation. But what happened is in the British journal Nature, starting in 2009, they found isotope evidence demonstrating that vegetation was abundant on the continental land masses for 200 million years before we have animals showing up in the oceans. And then in 2011, they came up with another discovery that said we not only have the isotope evidence, we have fossils. A bit of exaggeration, they had fossil parts. The biggest part they had was 1 millimeter across. But basically demonstrating that, hey, we now have evidence from fossils that vegetation was abundant on the land masses for 600 million years before we see the first appearance of animals in the ocean. So again, demonstrating the more we learn about science, the more evidence we get that the Bible got all the science right, and not just got it right in detail.
Where does the Bible agree with science in talking about we went from this cloud-shrouded sky that would not let the sunlight through? How did it change so you could start to have vegetation and you could have trees and all this kind of stuff?
Well, when I first read the Bible, we didn't know the scientific details that basically explain how it is Earth went from an opaque atmosphere to one that was translucent. We now know, as we described in the previous episode, that the solar system began with 5 planets. One of those planets, Theia, collided with the Earth, and how the collision thinned out Earth's atmosphere to just the right degree so we could have life on planet Earth, and thinned out the water to the right depth so that we could have not only simple life, but advanced life on planet Earth. If you don't thin the water, the continents are never going to break through to the surface. So that was a crucial feature. And you need a planet with both surface land masses and oceans to recirculate the nutrients that will allow life to remain on the planet for a long period of time. Well, you move into Creation Day 4, and this is where it talks about how creatures on the surface of the earth for the first time can see the sun, moon, and stars that God had created in the sky, which meant that the atmosphere went from translucent to transparent. And we know that the early Earth's atmosphere had a very low quantity of oxygen in it. You know, where you don't have much oxygen in the atmosphere, that atmosphere is going to be so hazy, you're not going to be able to see the sun from the surface, or the stars, or the moon. The haze is just going to be too thick. And what happened in 2018, a team of physicists had this big flask experiment where they filled the flask with what they knew the Earth's atmosphere contained, and then they gradually increased the oxygen content to see what would happen. It began with only a 0.010% oxygen in the atmosphere. When the continents were jumped up on the beginning of Creation Day 3, the oxygen jumped from less than 1% up to 2 or 3%, then went back down below 1%, stayed there for a long period of time, and then gradually jumped from 1 to 2%, and then up to 8%. All this is well known in the geological record. What these physicists did is they said, let's start with a flask where we got less than 1% oxygen. And when you had less than 1% oxygen, you couldn't see through the flask because of how hazy the atmospheric constituents were. Then they gradually increased the oxygen. And what I've done with audiences to simulate this is say, okay, here's a mountain that I climbed in Colorado, and I'm standing about a little less than half a mile away, and this is what the mountain looks like. When you have less than 1% oxygen, you can't see anything.
Right.
All you see is a thick haze.
Yeah.
And then you jump it up to about 4% oxygen, and you begin to see something barely visible in the background. You can say, well, there's something there.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then you gradually bring the oxygen content up from 4% to 5%, and then 6%. Now you mean to say, hey, there's a mountain there, just a little less than half a mile away. But once you get up to 8% oxygen, you see that there's something in the sky you've never seen before.
Yep.
Off to the upper right, you see the moon. And so basically demonstrating that Genesis indeed got it right in saying there was a time when the oxygen content increased rapidly from 2% to 8%. We know there were no animals until that time for a good reason. You can't have large-bodied animals if you only got 2% oxygen. The minimum you need is 8%. What's interesting, though, is the moment it hits 8%, you immediately have animals as big as 2 meters across in the oceans. Now, they're simple animals, because you can't have complex animals with only 8%, but the moment it has 8%, they're right there right away. And the thing about animals, they need to see the position of the sun, moon, and stars in the sky to regulate their complex biological clocks.
Absolutely.
And that's what you see described in Creation Day 4 and Creation Day 5. Creation Day 4, the sun, moon, and stars become visible to creatures on the surface of the earth for the first time. And what you see in Creation Day 5, that's when God creates animals that need to see those sun, moon, and stars in order to be able to survive. Now, where people get tripped up, verse 16 of Genesis 1 says, "So God made the sun, moon, and stars." And again, that's the English translation. Biblical Hebrew doesn't have verb tenses like you see in English. And so we see there in verse 16 is simply a note making the point God had already created the sun, moon, and stars. They were created before the fourth day, but they become visible on the surface of the earth on Creation Day 4 to creatures that are on that surface.
Yeah, interesting.
It is. And we've had this all documented on our website at reasons.org. Then you move into Creation Day 5, and it says, "Let the waters teem with living creatures." This is something that paleontologists have noted, is that the moment the oxygen goes from 2% to 8%, you immediately have these phyla of ocean-dwelling animals, but those animals relatively quickly go extinct because there's another geological event that causes the oxygen to jump from 8% up to 10%. It's called the Great Unconformity, where you have these massive landslides that stimulates a deep oxygen cycle, which causes this burst of oxygen. And this again kind of reminds you of how the oxygen went from 2% to 8%, and then a little bit later, it suddenly jumps up to 10%. The moment it hits 10%, you immediately have the Cambrian phyla, where about 30 distinct phyla, different body plans.
The Cambrian explosion.
The Cambrian explosion. And this is where you, for the first time, get creatures that have skeletons, that have circulatory systems, that have a digestive tract. You can't have that with 8% oxygen, but with 10%, all that's possible.
Yeah, and from what I know is the naturalists have a real problem with it because the animals that just appear in that Cambrian explosion are different kinds with all kinds of different body shapes. There's no evolving. All of a sudden they just appear and they're stumped.
Well, they are, because even the most advanced phylum, the most advanced body plan, shows up at the beginning of the Cambrian event when the oxygen for the first time hits 10%. Our phylum are the chordates, which basically includes all animals that have a backbone or a long neural cord that basically sends out nerves to the rest of the body parts. So all vertebrates are part of the chordate phylum. We now have fossil evidence that you have fish with bones and a backbone showing up at the beginning of the Cambrian explosion. And a number of paleontologists who are not theists have said, wait a minute, this is the opposite of what our naturalistic models predict.
Right.
Naturalistic models basically say you're going to have, with sufficient time, species diversifying, and eventually you get a new genus. Then the genera diversify and you get a new family. And the family diversify and you get a new order, you get a new class, and last of all, you get the diversification of phyla. The problem is, when you look at the fossil record, you see the exact opposite, that the phyla show up first, the species show up last. You get the diversification of phyla before you get the diversification of the classes, the orders, and last of all, you get the diversification of species. And what's really amazing, all the Cambrian phyla show up simultaneously when the oxygen jumps from 8 to 10%. There is no time delay. And here's a quote I got from James Valentine and his peers, where they wrote, the diversification of phyla occurs before that of classes, classes before that of orders, and orders before that of families, and they go on to say families before that of genera, and last of all, you get the species.
Yeah.
The exact opposite of what you'd expect from a naturalistic perspective, but exactly what you predict if you have a God that's aggressively creating life with the goal of preparing the planet Earth as fast as possible for the entry of his final goal, us human beings.
Yeah, wouldn't you say that the evidence, the scientific evidence that's been coming in these years is basically just killing Darwinism? Darwinism is dead.
Well, let me give you another quote. This is from Gregory Ray. He's a paleontologist.
Right.
He wrote in the American Zoologist, "The Cambrian explosion of body plans," those are the phylum,
Right.
poses an outstanding problem for macroevolution.
Yeah, I can't get there.
He can't get there. And a few years later, you got Kevin Peterson and his colleagues writing this, elucidating the materialistic basis, that's the non-theistic basis for the Cambrian explosion, has become more elusive, not less, the more we know about the event itself.
Right.
So here you got people who are not theists basically conceding our point. The more we learn about science, the stronger case we get that God supernaturally intervened to create these species, and he created them in an order that we see perfectly described in Genesis chapter 1.
All right, moving on.
Moving on, you get to the second part of creation, day 5, and this is where you see the use of the word create for the second time. You only see it 3 times in Genesis 1. First, when God creates the physical universe. The second time in creation, day 5, is when we create something that's not just physical, but also soulish. It's a reference to birds and mammals. So it talks about God creating birds that will fly in the atmosphere of the earth, and then the creation of sea mammals that would be in the waters of the earth.
You're talking about the word bara.
Well, actually it uses 2 verbs. It says God created them and he made them. Bara and asa in the Hebrew. Basically making the point, these birds and mammals that I'm creating for the first time,
Brand new.
something about them is brand new. Something about them is not brand new. Their physical bodies are not new. What's new is they're now endowed with mind, will, and emotions, so they can relate to one another. These are the animals where the parents will sacrifice to care for their young, but they're also animals that are endowed with the ability to relate to a higher species that does not yet exist. They're designed to serve and please us human beings, basically teaching us a lesson. As they were designed to serve a higher species, we humans were designed to serve a higher being.
What do people usually ask you when you get to this point?
Well, they say, isn't this another example where Genesis got it wrong? Because it's basically saying that God creates the sea mammals before he creates the land mammals. Here's what they're overlooking. Creation day 5 talks about God creating birds generically and sea mammals generically. When you get to creation day 6, it actually jumps ahead and talks about God creating 3 distinct kinds of land mammals. Basically the most advanced land mammals that God created to actually assist humanity in launching civilization. You know, we humans take way too much credit. We couldn't have launched global civilization if it wasn't for God creating before us animals that were crucial to getting civilization up the ground. And the 3 kinds that are mentioned, first it mentions the short-legged land mammals. This is a reference to the rodents. And you say, what do we need rodents for? Well, rodents are warm-blooded, small-bodied mammals, and they have to grow thick fur in order to keep themselves warm when it gets cold at night or cold during the winter time. They're designed in such a way that they like to cohabit with humans. I mean, you may have noticed there's rodents everywhere we live. And early humans basically took advantage of these creatures that like to hang around us. They were easy to feed, easy to take care of. And we humans were created with very little body hair, but we were able to harvest the pelts of these rodents and use them to manufacture clothing. And so we now know, for example, that the earliest humans were living in climate zones 15 degrees colder than the Neanderthals. even though our bodies were not adapted for living in a cold climate, unlike the Neanderthal bodies that were. The advantage we had sewing implements, and we could take the furs of these rodents and develop the clothing we need so we could actually become a global species. The other two kinds of animals it mentions are the long-legged animals that are easy to tame and the long-legged land mammals that are difficult to tame. And basically making the point, there's two categories of long-legged land mammals. The herbivores that are easy to tame and are designed to help us launch agriculture. And then we have those that are difficult to tame, the carnivores that we use to herd these animals, and they can basically serve as household pets. And we now know that the earliest humans were basically taming both kinds of long-legged land mammals. And so we use the goats, the sheep, the horses, the cows to assist us in agriculture. And also they provide another source of clothing. And then we use the ones that are difficult to tame, the carnivores, as household pets. The problem with the herbivores, they don't make good household pets, and they need to be fed all the time, whereas the carnivores, they can eat once a day, they're easy to housebreak, and they tend to be very affectionate towards us human beings, and they guard us from other wild animals.
Yeah. You are a non-Christian, basically looking at all of this, and after a time, you finally came to a conclusion. Tell me what that conclusion was, and why did it force you to come to God?
Well, John, I didn't have all the details in hand. That took later. But I did know just from the first reading of Genesis 1, it got the order right of the creation events, the descriptions were correct. And that was enough to convince me this book had to be inspired by the one that created the universe. And that's when I signed my name at the back of a Gideon Bible, dedicating my life to Jesus Christ.
This is a fantastic story, and I hope that you're enjoying hearing about these events. Next week, we're going to continue with this because I know you've got other questions. Some of the kids are saying, what happened to the dinosaurs? Where did they come in? And others of you are saying, where are the bipedal primates, the Neanderthals and other groups that came in? And I also want Hugh to talk about his own story, because he came out of a home where there were no Christians. He was not a Christian. His family wasn't a Christian. There was no church in his area. He didn't meet one until he was 17 years of age, when he was getting his postdoctoral work at Caltech. And I'm saying, I want you to hear the story of all those things, and we will do it next week. So please stick with us. But also, I've got a personal word for you, so stay tuned.
Stay tuned. John will be right back.